Ethan Calder stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, gazing at the Manhattan skyline. The view was breathtaking, a testament to his accomplishments as one of the city's most powerful CEOs. Yet, as he sipped his whiskey, the taste bitter on his tongue, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of unease that had followed him all day. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, and it unnerved him more than he cared to admit. In the distance, dark clouds gathered, signaling an approaching storm. Thunder rumbled faintly, and the first drops of rain began to streak the glass. Ethan's thoughts drifted, unbidden, to a chapter of his life he had locked away long ago. His jaw tightened as flashes of a cold night in the woods flickered through his mind. He could almost feel the biting chill, hear the cries that had haunted his dreams in the years that followed. He shook his head sharply, as if the motion could banish the memories. It was in the past, forgotten, irrelevant to the life he had built. Turning from the window, Ethan grabbed his phone and checked the time. A late meeting awaited, one he wasn't particularly eager to attend. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed with a notification. His assistant had messaged him about an incident at the building's entrance. A young street vendor was causing a disturbance, refusing to leave despite security's insistence. Ethan frowned, irritated by the distraction. He fired off a reply, ordering the situation to be handled quickly and discreetly. He didn't have time for disruptions. Downstairs, 12-year-old Hope clutched her small bundle of flowers tightly, her knuckles white from the effort. She stood beneath the awning of the towering office building, shielding herself from the rain that had begun to pour in earnest. Her thin jacket did little to protect her from the cold, and her dark curls stuck to her face, wet and unkempt. She had been trying to sell flowers all day, but the storm had driven most pedestrians indoors. Now, her last hope of making enough for a warm meal rested on the possibility of catching a wealthy businessman on his way out. "Move along, kid," one of the security guards growled, his tone gruff but not unkind. "You can't stay here." Hope lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremble in her limbs. "Please, sir, just a few more minutes. I only need to sell a couple more." The guard hesitated, his resolve wavering at the sight of the determined girl. Before he could respond, the door to the building swung open, and a tall man in an impeccable suit stepped out. "Ethan." He paused, his gaze falling on Hope. For a moment, they locked eyes, and something unfamiliar twisted in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name. "What's going on here?" Ethan asked curtly, his voice carrying the authority that came so naturally to him. The guard straightened. "Just a street vendor, Mr. Calder. I was about to send her off." Ethan's gaze lingered on Hope. Her wide brown eyes held defiance and desperation, a combination that unsettled him. "Let her in," he said suddenly, surprising both himself and the guard. Hope's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise with caution. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially not from men in suits. Still, she followed the guard as he gestured her inside, her small figure dripping water onto the polished marble floors. Ethan led them to a side room, away from the main lobby. He gestured for Hope to sit at a small table, then ordered coffee and sandwiches to be brought up. He didn't know why he was doing this. Perhaps it was the storm outside, or the faint resemblance the girl bore to someone he couldn't quite place. Hope watched him carefully, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her worn backpack. She wasn't sure what to make of this man who radiated power and wealth yet seemed strangely troubled. "Where are your parents?" Ethan asked, his tone brusque. Hope hesitated. She hated that question. It always led to pity or judgment, neither of which she wanted. "I don't have any," she said simply. Ethan's brow furrowed, but he didn't press further. The food arrived, and he gestured for her to eat. She hesitated for only a moment before hunger won out, and she began to devour the sandwich. He watched her, the discomfort in his chest growing. "What's your name?" he asked after a long silence. "Hope," she said between bites. "Hope," he repeated, the name feeling oddly significant as it left his lips. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the darkened sky. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This girl, this chance encounter, It stirred something he couldn't explain. It was as if the universe had placed her in his path for a reason. And as the rain fell, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if that reason was tied to the haunting memories he had spent so long trying to forget. He didn't know it yet, but hope was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. Ethan sat back in his chair, watching Hope as she finished the sandwich. The girl ate quickly, but not with desperation. There was a deliberate control to her movements, like someone who had learned to make the most of what they had without showing weakness. It was unsettling. Children her age shouldn't have to carry themselves with such restraint. "Why flowers?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Hope looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she answered. "People like flowers. They're pretty. They make people happy, even if just for a moment." Ethan nodded, not sure what to say. He couldn't remember the last time something as simple as a flower had made him feel anything. His world was cold, calculated. Beauty had its place, but only when it served a purpose. "What about school?" he asked, his tone quieter this time. Hope hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "I don't go anymore. I used to, but it got hard. It's not easy when you don't have a home." The words hit him harder than he expected, and he didn't know why. He had heard similar stories before, always from a distance, the kinds of narratives woven into charity galas or the occasional news report. But hearing it directly, from this small, brave girl sitting across from him, made it feel personal in a way he wasn't prepared for. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed, pulling him back to his reality. It was a reminder about the meeting he was already late for. He ignored it, an uncharacteristic move that surprised even him. "You shouldn't be out on the streets alone," he said finally. "It's not safe." Hope looked at him with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "What choice do I have? I've been taking care of myself for a long time." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. He could have her taken to a shelter, but something about that didn't sit right with him. Shelters were temporary solutions, and she deserved more than that. Yet the idea of getting personally involved was absurd. He barely had time for his own life, let alone someone else's. But as he studied her face, he felt a strange pull. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite place it. It wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she carried herself, the spark of determination in her eyes. It reminded him of someone, but the memory danced just out of reach. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. Hope shrugged. "I'll figure it out. I always do." Ethan's chest tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What if I offered you a place to stay? Somewhere safe. Just for a while, until you figure things out?" Hope stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." He hesitated. It was a good question. Why was he doing this? He didn't know her anything. He wasn't the type to play savior. Yet he couldn't walk away. "Not this time. Let's just say I've made mistakes in my life," he said slowly. "And maybe I see an opportunity to do something good for once." She studied him for a long moment before nodding, her reluctance giving way to a glimmer of hope that matched her name. "Okay, but only for a little while." That night, Ethan had one of his drivers take Hope to a small apartment he kept in the city, a place he rarely used. He gave her the keys and a number to call if she needed anything. He told himself it was temporary, that he was just helping her get back on her feet. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself thinking about Hope more often than he cared to admit. He checked in with her regularly, making sure she had everything she needed. Each time he spoke to her, he learned a little more about her past. A patchwork of foster homes, shelters, and brief moments of stability that had all fallen apart. She spoke about it with a quiet strength that made his chest ache. Then, one evening, she mentioned something that stopped him cold. "I have this," she said, pulling a small object from her backpack. It was a gold badge, tarnished with age but still legible. "It's the only thing I've had since I was a baby. I don't know where it came from, but I've always kept it." Ethan's breath caught as he stared at the badge. His heart pounded in his chest, the room seeming to tilt slightly. He recognized it instantly. The initials etched into the metal, EC, were unmistakable. He had given that badge to someone years ago, someone he had desperately tried to forget. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. Hope shrugged. "I don't know. They said I was found with it. I've had it as long as I can remember." Ethan leaned back, his mind racing. Memories flooded in. Memories he had buried deep. Memories of a night that had haunted him ever since. The cold forest, the sound of a baby's cries, the moment he turned and walked away. He had thought it was behind him, thought he could move on. But now, sitting in front of him, was the living reminder of his greatest failure. He felt sick. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized the truth. Hope wasn't just a child he had decided to help out of pity or guilt. She was his child, the one he had abandoned, the one he had convinced himself would never cross his path again. Hope looked at him, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan forced a smile, though his hands trembled as he reached for his glass of water. "I'm fine," he said, though he was anything but. As Hope tucked the badge back into her bag, unaware of the storm brewing inside him, Ethan knew his life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. He paced the length of his penthouse, his mind replaying every detail of the encounter with Hope. The badge, her age, the fragmented memories she shared. It all pointed to the truth he didn't want to face. She was his daughter, the child he had abandoned in the woods 12 years ago. In a moment of cowardice he had tried to justify but never truly forgiven himself for. His chest tightened as the weight of it settled over him. He had always told himself that what he did was necessary, that he wasn't equipped to care for a child, let alone one born with challenges he couldn't understand. But standing in the face of who she had become, hearing her story, seeing her resilience, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame, and something deeper, more piercing. Regret. By morning, Ethan was no closer to a solution. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his face lined with exhaustion. He had built his life on control, on mastering every situation to his advantage. But this was chaos, and it terrified him. At the office, his usual focus was nowhere to be found. Meetings blurred together, and his assistant had to nudge him repeatedly to pull his attention back to the matters at hand. Even the high-stakes negotiations that once thrilled him felt hollow. His mind was with Hope. How could he approach her with the truth? How could he explain the unexplainable? That evening, unable to stay away, he visited the apartment. Hope greeted him with a cautious smile, her guarded demeanor still firmly in place. She had changed into a clean outfit he had arranged for her, and her hair was pulled back neatly, though stray curls framed her face. Despite the improvement in her appearance, her eyes carried the same quiet determination that had struck him from the start. "I wasn't expecting you," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He noticed the room was tidy, the furniture sparse but neatly arranged. On the small coffee table sat a bouquet of flowers, likely leftovers from her street sales. The sight of them stirred something in him, though he couldn't pinpoint what. "I just wanted to check in," he said finally, his voice careful. "Make sure everything's okay." Hope nodded. "It's fine. Better than fine. Actually, I don't think I've ever stayed somewhere this nice before." Her words twisted the knife already lodged in his heart. He gestured toward the flowers. "Those from today?" She nodded, a hint of pride in her expression. "I saved some from the last batch. They were going to wilt anyway, but I think they make the place feel more alive." Ethan found himself smiling faintly, though it quickly faded as the weight of the truth returned. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly. He needed to tell her, but the words wouldn't come. "Not yet. Do you ever think about your family?" he asked, his tone casual, though his heart raced. Hope's expression shifted, her guard going up again. She sat across from him, her hands resting on her knees. "Not really. I mean, I don't remember them. I was just a baby when I ended up in the system. I guess. Sometimes I wonder what happened. Why they left me." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Ethan felt his chest constrict. She wasn't asking him directly, but he felt the accusation nonetheless. He had left her. He had made that choice. And now, sitting across from her, He realized how deeply he had scarred her life. Maybe they thought they were doing the right thing, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Hope tilted her head, studying him. That's a strange way to put it. Ethan forced a weak smile. Life isn't always black and white, Hope. Sometimes people make choices they think are for the best, even if they turn out to be mistakes. She frowned but didn't push further. Instead, she changed the subject, asking him about his day, his work. It was a distraction, but Ethan welcomed it. He couldn't tell her yet. Not until he found a way to do it that wouldn't destroy her. The next few days passed in a haze. Ethan continued to visit Hope, their conversations growing more comfortable, yet leaving him increasingly conflicted. Each time he saw her, he was reminded of how much he had missed. Her intelligence, her humor, her kindness. It was all there, despite the hardships she had endured. He couldn't reconcile the person she was with the decision he had made all those years ago. Meanwhile, Hope began to feel a cautious trust building toward Ethan. He wasn't like the other adults she had met. He listened when she spoke, treated her with a respect she wasn't used to. But there was something about him she couldn't quite figure out, a shadow in his eyes, a hesitation in his words. It was as if he carried a secret, one she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Then one evening, as they shared dinner in the apartment, Hope brought out the badge again. She placed it on the table between them, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about this," she said. "It has to mean something, right? Someone cared enough to leave it with me." Ethan stared at the badge, his stomach twisting. The moment he had been dreading was here, and he wasn't ready. But Hope's gaze was steady, her curiosity unrelenting. "It does mean something," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than you know." Hope's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ethan took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. "I think it's time I told you the truth. About me. About you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Ethan felt the weight of the past 12 years press down on him as he prepared to say the words that would change everything. Ethan sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Hope's wide, questioning eyes were locked on his, and he realized he couldn't delay the truth any longer. He had spent years running from his past, but now, it had found him in the form of the girl sitting across the table. Her presence demanded honesty, no matter how much it might hurt. He picked up the badge from the table, turning it over in his hand as if it might somehow soften what he was about to say. "This badge," he began, his voice tight, "it belonged to me. I gave it to someone a long time ago." Hope's brow furrowed, her confusion growing. "You gave it to someone? What does that mean? How did it end up with me?" Ethan's throat tightened, and he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Because that someone was you, Hope. I gave it to you when you were a baby." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Hope stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and growing fear. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan set the badge down carefully, his hands trembling. "You were my child," he said, the past tense slipping out unintentionally. "You are my child." Hope recoiled slightly, her eyes darting between him and the badge. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That doesn't make sense. You're lying." "I'm not lying," Ethan said quickly, his voice pained. "I wish I were, but it's the truth. I'm the one who left you. I'm the one who made the worst mistake of my life." Hope's chair scraped against the floor as she pushed it back, standing abruptly. Her face was pale, her expression stricken. "You're saying you abandoned me? Just left me somewhere? Why would you do that? What kind of person does that?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice raw. "I was young and selfish. I told myself I couldn't handle it, that you'd be better off without me. But it wasn't true. It was a lie I told myself to make it easier. And it's haunted me every day since." Hope's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You didn't think about me? About what would happen to me? You just gave up?" "I thought I was doing the right thing," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I thought someone else would take care of you, someone better than me. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. Tears filled Hope's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. You had no right to decide that. You had no right to throw me away like I didn't matter. You're right, Ethan said, his own eyes glistening. I had no right, and I can never take back what I did, but I want to try to make it right. I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me. Hope turned away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Why now? She asked, her voice trembling. Why not before? Why didn't you come looking for me? Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Because I was a coward, he said. Because I was afraid of facing the person I used to be. But seeing you now, hearing what you've been through, I can't run from it anymore. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I want you to know the truth. You deserve that much. Hope didn't respond immediately. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders shaking slightly as she fought to keep her emotions in check. Finally, she turned around, her face streaked with tears. I don't even know what to say to you, she whispered. I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't good enough, why no one wanted me. And now you're telling me it was you all along? Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully. You were always good enough, he said, his voice breaking. It wasn't you. It was me. I was too blind to see what I had, and I've regretted it every day since. Hope stared at him, her expression a mix of anger, hurt, and something he couldn't quite place. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, she said finally. How do you forgive something like this? Ethan nodded slowly, his heart sinking. I understand, he said. I hope someday you'll be able to see that I'm trying to be better. For you. Hope didn't answer. She grabbed her backpack from the chair and slung it over her shoulder, her movements quick and tense. I need some air, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stepped aside, not wanting to stop her. Take all the time you need, he said softly. She didn't look at him as she walked out the door, leaving him standing alone in the empty apartment. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the silence, and Ethan sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. He had told her the truth, but it felt hollow, incomplete. He had hoped it might bring some measure of relief, but all he felt was the crushing weight of her pain and his own failure. For the first time in years, Ethan felt utterly powerless, and he knew that whatever happened next was no longer in his control. Hope walked aimlessly through the streets, her mind a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. The city's usual noise seemed muted against the storm raging inside her. She clutched the straps of her backpack tightly, her knuckles white, trying to keep herself together. She couldn't believe what Ethan had told her. She didn't want to believe it. How could the man who had taken her in, who seemed so calm and in control, be the same person who had abandoned her when she was just a baby? The badge weighed heavy in her bag, a small object that now carried so much more meaning. She had kept it for years, hoping it might one day lead her to answers. Now that she had them, they felt like a cruel joke. Her feet carried her to a nearby park, one of the few places she felt she could think. The benches were nearly empty, the air crisp and still. She sat down, pulling her knees to her chest as her thoughts swirled. Her whole life, she had been asking herself questions. Who were her parents? Why had they left her? What had she done to deserve being abandoned? And now, she had answers to some of those questions, but they only left her feeling hollow. Ethan's words replayed in her mind, his voice raw with emotion she hadn't expected. He said he regretted it every day, that he wanted to make things right. But could she ever trust someone who had made such a monumental choice to leave her behind? She stayed in the park until the sun dipped low on the horizon, her mind jumping between memories of her life and the few pieces of information Ethan had given her. She remembered the foster homes, the loneliness, the constant feeling of being unworthy of love. Now, knowing that her father had been alive and capable all along, that he had chosen to walk away, it felt like salt in a wound that had never fully healed. When the streetlights flickered on, Hope finally stood, her limbs stiff from sitting so long. She didn't know where she wanted to go, but she couldn't bring herself to return to the apartment. Not yet. She needed more answers, and there was one person she thought might have them. She reached into her bag for the battered notebook she always carried, flipping to a page with a phone number scrawled hastily in the margin. It belonged to the social worker who had helped her years ago, someone who had told her to call if she ever needed anything. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number from a payphone on the corner. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Arnett, it's Hope," she said, her voice shaking. There was a pause, then warmth in the response. "Hope, it's been so long. Are you okay?" Hope hesitated, unsure how much to say. I need some help. I think I found my dad. But it's complicated." The social worker's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Where are you? Can we meet?" They agreed on a nearby diner, and Hope made her way there, her heart pounding the entire time. Ms. Arnett was already seated in a booth when Hope arrived, her kind face lined with concern. Hope slid into the seat across from her, feeling a flicker of relief at the familiarity. "Tell me everything," Ms. Arnett said gently. Hope hesitated, but then began recounting the events of the past few days. She explained how she had met Ethan, how he had helped her, and then finally, the revelation about who he really was. As she spoke, Ms. Arnett listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Hope finished, she leaned back in the booth, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "He says he regrets it, but how do I even begin to trust him?" Ms. Arnett sighed, her hands clasped on the table. "Hope, I've been in this line of work for a long time, and I've seen parents make mistakes, some of them terrible, like this one, but I've also seen people change. It sounds like Ethan is trying to take responsibility now, even if it's years too late." Hope frowned. "But what if it's just guilt? What if he's only doing this to make himself feel better?" "That's a valid concern," Ms. Arnett said, "but actions speak louder than words. Watch what he does, not just what he says. If he's truly sorry, he'll show it. He'll be consistent. And if he doesn't, then you'll know." Hope looked down at her hands, her mind swirling. Part of her wanted to believe that Ethan's regret was real, that he was genuine in his desire to make amends. But another part of her, the part that had spent years surviving on her own, was screaming not to let her guard down. "What if I can't forgive him?" she asked quietly. Ms. Arnett reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "Forgiveness isn't something you do for someone else, Hope. It's something you do for yourself. If holding on to this anger keeps you from moving forward, then it's worth considering. But if you're not ready, that's okay too. Healing takes time." Hope nodded, though the lump in her throat made it hard to respond. They sat in silence for a moment before Ms. Arnett spoke again. "Do you want me to help you look into him? His past? His story? Maybe knowing more will help you decide." Hope considered it, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I need to know everything." Ms. Arnett gave her a reassuring smile. "Then we'll figure it out together." As they left the diner, Hope felt a small spark of hope. Ironically, the thing she'd been named for. She didn't know what the future held, but at least now she had someone in her corner. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to face whatever came next. Ethan sat alone in his office late into the night, the city lights casting long shadows across the sleek, modern decor. He had buried himself in work for hours, desperate for distraction, but his thoughts kept circling back to Hope. Every word she had said, every ounce of pain he had seen in her eyes, replayed in his mind like a broken record. He had told her the truth, but instead of relief, it felt like he had unleashed a storm with no end in sight. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass before setting it down untouched. This wasn't something he could drink away. He had spent years compartmentalizing his emotions, locking them away behind the polished exterior he presented to the world. But now, those walls were crumbling, and he didn't know how to rebuild them. Or if he even wanted to. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be an urgent business matter. Instead, he saw a name he hadn't seen in years, Detective Leonard Hayes. His stomach tightened as he hesitated, debating whether to answer. Finally, he picked up, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Hayes, Ethan," the detective replied, his voice gravelly. "Been a while." "It has," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. I heard you've been spending time with a girl. A young one. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. What of it? I've been looking into her, Hayes said, his tone measured. And it didn't take long to connect the dots. You really think you can make up for what you did all those years ago by playing the Good Samaritan now? Ethan closed his eyes, the accusation cutting deeper than he cared to admit. I don't owe you an explanation, Hayes. Maybe not, Hayes said, but you owe her one. And more than that, you owe her a life she can rely on. You can't just swoop in and expect her to forgive you because you feel guilty. Ethan clenched his jaw. I know that. Do you? Hayes asked, his voice sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just trying to ease your conscience. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a heavy cloak. Finally, he said, What do you want, Hayes? I want you to take this seriously, the detective said. That girl has been through enough. If you're not willing to give her everything, then step aside and let someone else help her. Ethan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to speak. I'm not stepping aside. I've made mistakes, but I'm not going to walk away from her again. Hayes was silent for a moment, then his tone softened slightly. Good. Because if you hurt her again, Ethan, you'll have me to answer to. The line went dead, and Ethan set the phone down with a sigh. Hayes had always been blunt, but he wasn't wrong. Hope deserved more than half measures, more than empty promises. She deserved a father who could be there for her, who could earn her trust, even if it took a lifetime. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside the apartment he had given Hope. He knocked on the door, his pulse racing as he waited. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Hope stood there, her expression guarded. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. I wasn't sure if you'd come back, she said, her voice neutral. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome, he admitted. Hope studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. He entered cautiously, his movements slow, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile truce between them. The apartment was just as he had left it, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Why are you here? She asked, crossing her arms as she leaned against the wall. Ethan turned to face her, his expression earnest. Because I meant what I said. I want to be here for you. Hope. Not just now, but for as long as you'll let me. Her eyes narrowed. And what does that mean? You think you can just show up and fix everything? No, he said quickly. I know I can't fix everything. I can't undo what I did. But I can try to make things better. I can try to earn your trust. Hope looked away, her jaw tight. I don't even know where to start with that. Then don't, Ethan said. You don't have to start anywhere. Just let me be here. Let me show you that I mean it. She didn't respond right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. Fine, but I'm not promising anything. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. That's all I'm asking. The rest of the day passed quietly. They talked, though the conversations were cautious, filled with stops and starts. Hope asked questions, and Ethan answered as honestly as he could. He told her about his life, his mistakes, and his reasons for leaving. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he thought she might walk away. But she stayed, and that gave him hope. As the sun set, they sat together in the small living room, the tension between them easing slightly. Ethan glanced at Hope, who was staring out the window, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, he said softly. She turned to him, her brow furrowed. For what? For giving me a chance, he said. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. Hope didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked back out the window, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. Don't make me regret it. Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. He didn't know how long it would take or how much he would have to prove himself, but he was ready to try. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, and he wasn't going to let her down again. The following weeks unfolded in small but significant steps. Ethan and Hope began to settle into a tentative routine, one built on careful exchanges and cautious trust. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between progress and potential setbacks. Ethan knew he was on borrowed time, and every moment mattered. Hope was still reserved, her walls firmly in place. She kept herself busy with the books Ethan had bought her, spending hours reading at the small table in the apartment. When she wasn't reading, she sketched, her pencil moving swiftly over the paper in fluid lines. Ethan had been surprised the first time he saw her drawings. Landscapes, flowers, and faces brought to life with an artistic touch he hadn't expected. It was one of the few glimpses he'd had into her inner world, and he treasured it. One evening, Ethan decided to address the silence that often lingered between them. He walked into the apartment with a bag of takeout, the smell of Chinese food filling the air. Hope looked up from her sketchbook, her expression curious but wary. "I figured we could eat together," he said, setting the bag on the table. "Unless you're not hungry." She shrugged, but closed her sketchbook. "I guess I could eat." They sat across from each other, the cartons of food spread between them. Ethan noticed how Hope picked at her food at first, her appetite seemingly small. But as the minutes passed, she started eating more comfortably, the stiffness in her posture easing slightly. "Your sketches," Ethan began, breaking the silence. "They're really good. Did you take classes, or is it just something you picked up?" Hope glanced at him, her expression neutral. "I just practiced. It's something to do when things get quiet." "Well, you're talented," he said sincerely. "You could do something with that one day if you wanted." She shrugged again, but there was a faint hint of pride in her eyes. "Maybe." Ethan didn't push further. He learned to take the small victories where he could. They ate in relative silence for a while, the clinking of chopsticks and the rustle of cartons the only sounds. Finally, Hope set her fork down and looked at him directly. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" Ethan felt his stomach drop. He had been expecting the question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. He set his own fork down, taking a deep breath before responding. "Because I was a coward," he said honestly. "I convinced myself you were better off without me, that someone else would take care of you, give you what I couldn't. And when I realized how wrong I was, I didn't know how to face it. So I didn't." Hope's gaze didn't waver. "That's not an excuse." "It's not," Ethan agreed. "There's no excuse for what I did. I can't change the past, Hope. All I can do is try to do better now." She studied him for a moment longer before looking away. "It's just hard to believe you mean it. People say things all the time. It doesn't always mean they're true." Ethan nodded, his chest aching. "I get that, and I don't expect you to believe me right away. But I'll show you, however long it takes." They didn't say much more that evening, but something about the conversation lingered in the air. Ethan hoped it was a step forward, even if it was a small one. The next day, Hope surprised him by asking if they could go to the park together. It was a request so unexpected that Ethan had to take a moment to process it before agreeing. They walked side by side through the city streets, the park a bustling hub of activity despite the crisp fall weather. Hope wandered a few steps ahead of him, her gaze flitting over the trees and the children playing on the swings. She seemed lighter here, more at ease, and Ethan made a mental note to take her outside more often. He watched as she approached a street performer painting on a large canvas, her interest piqued by the bold strokes of color. "Do you ever paint?" Ethan asked when he caught up to her. Hope shook her head. "It's expensive. Paper and pencils are easier to carry around." Ethan nodded, making a silent promise to get her whatever supplies she needed. "Maybe you'll try it one day." She didn't respond, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. As they walked back to the apartment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were making progress, however slowly. He knew he couldn't rush her, couldn't push too hard, but he also knew he had to keep showing up, proving that he was serious about being there for her. That night, as they sat in the living room, Hope pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing again. Ethan watched her quietly, marveling at the way she seemed to lose herself in her art. After a while, she looked up at him. "Do you want to see?" she asked, holding the sketchbook out. Ethan felt a wave of emotion rise in his chest as he took the book. The page was filled with a drawing of the park they had visited earlier, the trees and people rendered with a level of detail that took him by surprise. "This is incredible," he said sincerely. "You have a real gift." Hope ducked her head. a shy smile spreading across her face. "Thanks." Ethan handed the book back to her, his heart full. It was the first time she had willingly shared something so personal with him, and it felt like a breakthrough. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and Hope continued to build their fragile bond. Each step forward measured, careful, and sometimes hesitant. Ethan began to see glimpses of a lighter side to Hope. The way her eyes lit up when she discovered a new book, or the rare, fleeting smile that would cross her face when she caught him making a clumsy mistake. It was like watching a flower bloom slowly, each petal unfolding with cautious deliberation. Hope, in turn, began to let her guard down, though not entirely. There were still moments when she would retreat into herself, the weight of her past pulling her back into familiar defenses. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt the faint stirrings of safety, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. One afternoon, Ethan came home early with a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the small dining table and called out to Hope, who was in her room reading. She emerged, her brow furrowed in curiosity as she eyed the package. "What's that?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Open it and see," Ethan said, stepping back to give her space. Hope hesitated for a moment before walking over and carefully peeling back the paper. Her eyes widened as the contents were revealed. A professional-grade set of art supplies, complete with brushes, paints, canvases, and a sturdy easel. Her gaze darted to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Why did you get this?" "Because I see how talented you are," he said softly, "and I want you to have the tools to explore that. You deserve to." For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers brushing over the vibrant tubes of paint and the smooth wood of the easel. "This must have cost a lot," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter," Ethan replied. "What matters is that it's something you care about, and I want to support that." Hope looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. She quickly blinked away. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan smiled, relieved and grateful for her reaction. "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll use it." Hope nodded, her hands already reaching for one of the brushes. "I will." The easel found a place by the window in the small apartment, and over the following days, it became clear that painting was more than a hobby for Hope. It was an outlet, a way for her to process and express everything she carried inside. Ethan often found her standing by the window, her brush moving across the canvas with a focus and intensity that left him in awe. One evening, as she worked on a particularly vivid painting of a forest scene, Ethan approached her cautiously. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the canvas. Hope glanced at him briefly before returning to her work. "It's just something I remember." Ethan's chest tightened at her words. "The forest?" She nodded. "I don't remember much from when I was little, but I remember the trees. How cold it was. How quiet." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt rising in his throat. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. Hope didn't look at him, but her brush paused mid-stroke. "I know." The weight of those two words lingered between them, and Ethan knew they carried more meaning than she let on. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. It was a step. That same week, Ms. Arnett, the social worker Hope had contacted, called to check in. Hope was in the middle of a painting when Ethan handed her the phone, and she took it eagerly, retreating to her room for privacy. Ethan tried not to eavesdrop, but he couldn't help catching snippets of the conversation. "Yeah, he's trying," Hope said at one point, her tone uncertain but not dismissive. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. He knew he still had a long way to go, but hearing even the faintest hint of acceptance from Hope gave him a renewed sense of determination. Later that evening, as they sat together eating dinner, Hope surprised him with a question. "What was your childhood like?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He set down his fork and thought for a moment before answering. "It was complicated. My parents weren't around much. They were busy building their careers, their lives. I guess I always felt like I was in the way." Hope's expression softened slightly, though she kept her gaze on her plate. "Is that why you left me?" Because you didn't want to feel that way again? Ethan's breath caught, and he struggled to find the right words. Maybe, in a way. I was afraid I wouldn't be good enough. That I'd fail you the same way I felt my parents failed me. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't excuse what I did. Hope didn't respond immediately. She took a bite of her food, chewing thoughtfully. At least you're honest about it, she said finally. Ethan nodded, grateful for even the smallest sign of understanding. I'll always be honest with you, Hope. You deserve that. As the days turned into weeks, their tentative relationship began to take root. Hope started sharing more about her life, her experiences in foster care, the moments of kindness, and the many instances of neglect. Ethan listened intently, his heart breaking for everything she had endured. In turn, he opened up about his own struggles, his failures, and the reasons behind the choices he had made. They weren't easy conversations, but they were necessary. One evening, as they walked home from the park, Hope surprised Ethan by reaching out and taking his hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he squeezed her hand gently, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing day. The first painting Hope completed with her new supplies was a forest scene, vibrant and alive with color. She showed it to Ethan one evening, her expression a mix of pride and vulnerability. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. "You've got a real gift, Hope." She smiled faintly, her eyes meeting his. "Thanks." Ethan framed the painting and hung it in the living room, a constant reminder of how far they had come. It wasn't just a work of art. It was a symbol of resilience, of growth, and of the bond they were slowly building. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was part of something meaningful, something that mattered. And for the first time, Hope felt like she might have a place where she truly belonged. They still had a long way to go, but they were moving forward together, step by step, and that was enough. As the leaves turned and the crisp autumn air gave way to the first hints of winter, Ethan and Hope found themselves settling into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady, and that was more than either of them had dared to hope for at the beginning. The apartment, once a temporary refuge, was beginning to feel like a home. Hope's paintings adorned the walls, bringing life and color to the once sterile space, and her laughter, though rare, had started to punctuate the quiet moments. Ethan marveled at how much she had changed in such a short time. Her confidence was growing, not just in her art but in herself. She spoke more freely now, sometimes teasing him with a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh harder than he had in years. Yet, beneath her emerging strength, there were still moments when her guard went up, when shadows of doubt and hurt flickered in her eyes. He knew better than to push her during those times, understanding that trust was a fragile thing, built slowly and tested often. One Saturday, Hope asked Ethan if they could visit a local art gallery she had read about in a magazine. The request surprised him, not because she wanted to go. Her love for art was evident, but because she had chosen to ask him. It was the first time she had initiated an outing, and Ethan jumped at the opportunity to spend time with her. The gallery was small and tucked away in a quieter part of the city. Inside, the walls were lined with a mix of contemporary pieces and classic reproductions. Hope wandered from room to room, her eyes wide with curiosity and admiration. Ethan followed a few steps behind, content to let her lead the way. Watching her engage with the art, he felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. This was who she was meant to be, curious, passionate, unafraid to explore the world around her. At one point, Hope stopped in front of a large painting of a serene forest scene. The soft, dappled light filtering through the trees reminded Ethan of her own work, and he could see her studying it intently. "What do you think?" he asked, stepping beside her. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But it feels lonely." Ethan glanced at her, his heart aching at the quiet sadness in her tone. "Not all forests are lonely," he said gently. "Sometimes they're just waiting for someone to walk through them." Hope looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Maybe. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the gallery, and by the time they left, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city streets. On the way home, they stopped at a small cafe for hot chocolate. It was a simple outing, but for both of them, it felt significant, a step toward something neither of them could quite define but both deeply needed. That evening, as they sat in the living room sipping their drinks, Hope surprised Ethan with a question that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't left me?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan set his mug down, the question hitting him like a weight. He had thought about it more times than he could count, but hearing her ask it was different. It wasn't just a hypothetical to her. It was a wound, one she was still trying to understand. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about it every day, about how different things could have been if I had made a better choice." Hope looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "Do you think it would have been better?" "For me, I mean." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I can't change the past, and I can't pretend to know what would have happened. But I do know that I made the wrong choice back then. And I'm sorry, Hope. More than I can ever say." She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said after a long pause. "But I don't hate you anymore. I thought I did, but I don't." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling him out of the sea of guilt he had been drowning in. He didn't expect her forgiveness, but knowing she no longer hated him was more than he had dared to hope for. "That means more to me than you know," he said softly. The weeks that followed brought more small moments of connection. Hope began to let Ethan into her world little by little, showing him her favorite books, her sketches, and even sharing stories about the few foster families who had treated her with kindness. Ethan, in turn, opened up about his own life, sharing stories about his childhood and the journey that had led him to where he was now. They weren't easy conversations, but they were honest, and they brought them closer. One night, as Hope worked on a new painting, Ethan sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents for work. The quiet hum of the apartment was comforting, a far cry from the sterile silence he had grown used to in his old life. Hope's voice broke the silence, pulling him from his thoughts. "Do you ever feel like you're finally where you're supposed to be?" she asked, not looking up from her canvas. Ethan set his papers aside, her question catching him off guard. "I think I do now," he said after a moment. "What about you?" She hesitated, her brush hovering over the canvas. "I think I might be getting there." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. "I'm glad." As winter settled in, the city transformed, its streets dusted with snow and its parks adorned with twinkling lights. Hope seemed to thrive in the season, her energy brightening along with the holiday decorations. Ethan took her to see a tree lighting ceremony, and though she tried to act unimpressed, he caught her smiling more than once. It was during one of those snowy evenings that Hope presented Ethan with a gift, a painting she had been working on in secret. It depicted a forest, similar to her earlier works, but this one was different. The light filtering through the trees was warm and inviting, and in the center of the scene stood two figures, a man and a girl, walking side by side. Ethan stared at the painting, his throat tightening as he took in the details. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Hope shrugged, but her cheeks flushed with a hint of pride. "I figured you should have something for the wall that actually means something." Ethan looked at her, his heart full. "It means everything." That night, as they sat together in the glow of the Christmas lights, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgetting the past, but the kind that came from facing it head-on and choosing to move forward. And for the first time, he felt like they were truly moving toward a future worth building together. The holidays came and went, leaving a lingering warmth in the apartment that neither Ethan nor Hope wanted to see fade. Snow blanketed the city, and their days found a quieter rhythm. Ethan continued to step back from the demanding pace of his business, redirecting his focus to building a life with hope. For him, the clarity of purpose was liberating. For Hope, it was transformative. She had started to trust that this new version of her father wasn't temporary, that he wasn't going to disappear the way so many others had. One cold morning, Ethan suggested they take a trip to the countryside, a place he had visited years ago but had rarely returned to since his work consumed most of his time. Hope agreed, curious and eager for a change of scenery. They packed lightly and left the city in one of Ethan's cars, the heat from the vents warming the chilled windows as they sped along winding roads. The countryside was blanketed in snow, the fields and trees stretching endlessly under a pale gray sky. As they arrived at the small cabin Ethan had arranged for them to stay in, Hope stepped out of the car and stared at the surrounding forest, her breath visible in the crisp air. "It's quiet here," she said, her voice almost reverent. Ethan nodded, watching her take it all in. "I thought you might like it." They spent the afternoon exploring the nearby trails, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Hope's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and Ethan couldn't help but smile at how at ease she seemed. The air was sharp but invigorating, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like they were both breathing more deeply. That evening, as the sky darkened and the cabin's fireplace crackled with warmth, Hope sat by the window with her sketchbook. Ethan joined her, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She accepted hers with a small smile, setting her pencil down to wrap her hands around the warm mug. "This place is beautiful," she said, her gaze on the snow-covered trees outside. "I thought it might remind you of your paintings," Ethan said. "The way you capture the light in the trees. It's the first thing I thought of when I saw this place." Hope glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "You really pay attention to my work, don't you?" "I do," Ethan said. "It's important to me." "You're important to me." She looked down at her mug, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not used to that." Ethan's heart ached at her words, but he didn't push. "You should be," he said simply. The evening passed quietly, the kind of silence that felt comforting rather than awkward. They played a few rounds of cards, laughing when Ethan consistently forgot the rules, and Hope finally taught him how to sketch. His attempt at a tree was lopsided and awkward, but she praised it nonetheless, her laughter filling the cabin as he muttered about needing more practice. Later that night, as the fire dwindled and the cabin settled into stillness, Hope spoke again, her voice hesitant but steady. "Do you ever think about what you want for the future?" Ethan looked up from the book he had been pretending to read, surprised by the question. "All the time," he admitted. "More now than I ever have." "What do you want?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. He set the book down, meeting her gaze. "I want to be here for you, to give you the stability and the love you should have always had. I want to make sure you have every opportunity to pursue your dreams, whether it's art or something else. And I want to build a life that we can both feel proud of." Hope stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, as if accepting his answer. "That's good," she said softly. "I think that's good." The next morning, they woke early to watch the sunrise. Wrapped in thick coats and scarves, they stood outside the cabin as the first rays of light broke over the horizon, painting the snow in hues of gold and pink. Hope pulled out her sketchbook, her pencil moving quickly over the page as she tried to capture the moment. Ethan watched her, his hands tucked into his coat pockets to fight the cold. "You've got a real gift," he said quietly. "Do you ever think about what you want for the future?" Hope paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. She didn't look at him as she answered. "I used to think I didn't have a future, that it wasn't something I got to think about. But now, I don't know. Maybe I do." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. "You do, Hope? And whatever it is you want, I'll be here to support you." She glanced at him then, her expression soft but serious. "I know." They spent the rest of the day exploring more trails, their conversations light and easy. Hope's laughter came more frequently now, and Ethan found himself cherishing each sound, each moment they shared. He had spent so much of his life chasing material success, but nothing compared to the fulfillment he felt now. As their time in the countryside came to an end, Hope asked if they could return someday. Ethan agreed without hesitation, promising her they'd come back as often as she wanted. The drive back to the city was quiet but comfortable, both of them lost in their thoughts. Over the next few months, their relationship continued to deepen. Ethan worked hard to show Hope that his commitment to her wasn't fleeting, and she began to trust that he meant it. She started talking about her dreams, attending an art school, traveling to see the works of the great masters, and maybe even exhibiting her own work one day. Ethan encouraged her every step of the way, helping her research programs and offering to support her financially though she insisted on applying for scholarships to prove she could earn her place. On the day she received her acceptance letter to a prestigious art program, Hope ran into the apartment, waving the envelope in her hand. "I got in," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. Ethan stood, his face breaking into a broad smile. "I knew you would," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You deserve this, Hope." She hugged him back tightly, her voice muffled as she said, "Thank you for everything." Ethan pulled back, looking her in the eyes. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad I get to be here for you now." As the seasons changed and their lives continued to grow, Ethan and Hope found a sense of peace they had both thought impossible. Their journey had been anything but easy, but they had found their way together, step by step, and for the first time, they both felt ready to embrace whatever the future held. What would you do if life gave you a second chance to right a wrong? Reflect on this powerful story and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to check out the next heartwarming videos on our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.